Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, evacuations began as a massive chlorine cloud spread east into Alberton. We now continue with Part 1 and the conclusion of Chapter 6. Gassed. Ongoing response. Around 4:30 a.m., 911 called the Missoula Rural Fire Department, who dispatched a regional hazmat team that recently formed. Missoula Hazmat's goal was to respond to calls within 60 to 90 minutes, their task being to reconnoiter, assess, and, if possible, control the spill site. At 5:17 a.m., Missoula Rural Fire requested a means alert, Missoula Emergency All Notification System, after 911 said the sheriff's office had not requested one. This bulletin went out to all news media and schools to notify citizens of an emergency and give key information about the threat and evacuations. MRFD also called for a general evacuation from the Natural Pier Bridge to the 9-mile exit, unaware of Waldron's plans. At 5:23 a.m., Waldron also requested a means alert, but 911's Driggers said Sheriff Doug Chase was advising to stand by on the means alert. Waldron: Negative. We want one done now. He's not at this location. We have heavy chlorine moving eastbound. We want that means alert done. Waldron had just retreated to 9 Mile. Sheriff Chase seemed out of touch, but everyone was late on the means alert, including Waldron. Waldron recalled, "Well, we were pretty busy up to that point, and again, we don't know where this cloud's going. It's not like you can sit down at 4:30 and say, gee, we should do a means alert. But it was the appropriate time to do it. I just hadn't got to it yet." Also at 5:23 a.m., a DJ from KGVO radio called 911 for information on the spill. Without a means alert, the media had not been officially advised about the emergency and could not inform the public about evacuations and potential exposures. Lieutenant Mike McMeekin recalled, "That was our main go-to system in 1996. People were checking radios and getting no information." The means alert was finally broadcast at 5:28 a.m., an hour and 21 minutes after the spill. This is a means alert from Frenchtown Fire Department. There is a train derailment west of Missoula at Petty Creek. We have a chlorine gas spill. The gas is moving eastbound. Request evacuation of the area. People respond calmly to an evacuation center at the Frenchtown High School. This means alert referred vaguely to evacuations and incorrectly cited Petty Creek as the spill area. The point was perhaps moot now. The gas had arrived there. Deputy Hintz said the earliest calls for evacuation, which he advised at 4:25 a.m., should have triggered the means alert. "It was an emergency. We needed the action now, so we would do it," he said. But that hadn't happened. I.C. Waldron was, quote, pretty busy, and Sheriff Chase even balked an hour later, not comprehending the emergency. In the case of a toxic spill, McMeekin agreed the alert needed to be put out immediately, followed by regular updates. IC had the responsibility. Jess Mickelson said the means alert should have happened within minutes. The response was scrambling. Uncertainty over the spill location, underestimation of the behavior of chlorine gas, coupled with uncertainty over what had spilled, delayed evacuation of Alberton, inadequate or lack of protective equipment, retreat of forward command, and belated public notification. Communication problems persisted. As the morning progressed, Deputy Hintz recalled, "Communication between me, Scott Waldron, and the Alberton Fire Department was non-existent. Because he didn't have the sheriff's frequencies, we didn't have the fire frequencies, and we had no way of communicating what we was doing," he said. Each agency had its own frequency, and they didn't use the few common ones because they weren't available on portable radios. Already pressed, 911 acted as a go-between to relay key information. Sergeant Ball added, "There were too many people on the same channel, on the air, and you really couldn't get a word in edgewise. And the people who had first-hand knowledge of what was going on had trouble getting to the IC team leaders that they needed to. But the communication problems were more than procedural and technical." Missoula Hazmat Ziegler said, "At first, everybody was doing their own thing. Frenchtown was freelancing, basically. We had no communications with anybody, and even the sheriff's department. At least, as an entry team, we had no idea who was doing what." Mickelson said that initially, communication between his hazmat team and Waldron was virtually non-existent, somewhat by choice, he thought. His agency got information from the sheriff's office and 911, but Waldron worked independently. Part of the problem was Frenchtown Fire was stuck on their tactical frequency, Mickelson said. Not only were they stuck on it, you could go on their frequency and they're not interested in talking to you because they're busy doing what they thought was the highest priority. So intentionally or not, you produce a communications block simply by your practices. Mickelson added, they always had a defensive posture. Scott Waldron was scared to death that we would be the hazmat provider for the county. Well, we already were. We had an agreement with the state of Montana to do it. He never participated on a regional team, because of his internal belief that he could deal with whatever he had to deal. As for Waldron, he simply claimed, we had good communications. I think we did fine. About 5:10 a.m., MRL dispatcher Carter Meyer finally asked B.J. McComb for the approximate railroad milepost location of the derailment. McComb replied, 154.6 or .7, I think. Waldron, of course, had already talked to the engineers, but there was no indication that MRL or Waldron passed on this crucial information. Instead, 911 continued to incorrectly tell responders the spill was at Petty Creek, though it mattered less as the gas spread. But dispatchers' confusion still had repercussions for evacuees and the hazmat response. Residents calling 911 continued to be told inaccurate, confusing, and nonsensical information about the spill location, toxic cloud movement, and evacuations, resulting in inefficient, time-consuming exchanges well over an hour after the derailment. 911 continued to withhold crucial information from residents as well. Around 5:20 a.m., a caller reported to dispatcher Bloom, I went through that ammonia stuff or whatever it was. Is that stuff really dangerous? 911, you might want to call the hospital and speak to them about it. The caller was not told chlorine had spilled or the health threat. Ignorance was an enemy. Residents needed to know the facts of the danger, especially those living near the spill, and they in turn could help by spreading correct information to their neighbors. But no information number had yet been set up for callers, and the means alert had not yet been given to the media. Early callers relied on 911 for basic life-saving information. While the three dispatchers struggled to handle the communications load, the day shift, including a dedicated supervisor, was not scheduled to arrive until 7 a.m. Golden. The phones were ringing so furious, and our administration lines, we just flat couldn't get to them, so we just let them ring. Center Supervisor Suri Latham finally got a line through, and we said, Suri, we are so buried. We need the next shift to come in early. Latham and 4 extra workers arrived between about 5:30 a.m. to 6:15 a.m., each getting a quick debriefing. Yet dispatchers continued to tell callers the spill was in, quote, the Petty Creek area, and the new crew understood even less. One caller said he lived directly in Alberton and wanted to make sure how to evacuate his grandparents. To him, evacuating east made no sense if the spill was at Petty Creek. As he tried to get more information, the dispatcher cut him off, saying, I've got other things to do. The caller conceivably evacuated west toward the spill. The confusion also contributed to unnecessarily long calls. Another dispatcher didn't understand where the spill was, how far the cloud had traveled, or what areas had been evacuated. 911 simply advised, if you see a big cloud of gas, don't drive through it. Another Alberton resident was advised, I don't believe it makes any difference which way you go on. 2 full hours after the spill, an overwhelmed 911 was the source of information for callers about the gas cloud and evacuation other than the vague means alert. Evacuees. To prepare for the flood of evacuees, responders initially looked to Frenchtown, 15 miles distant and midway to Missoula. Deputy Hintz radioed Deputy McNeil to set up an evacuation center at Frenchtown High School. Hintz also asked 911 to notify the Red Cross. Local chapter manager Dot Northcutt responded that, we probably don't need anything but maybe coffee and food, or what would you say? Driggers. At this point, that sounds fine. Despite Driggers telling Northcutt that chlorine was a toxic situation, there was no discussion of medical aid or decontamination. Potentially hundreds of injured evacuees were on the way. The impromptu evac center and the Red Cross were ready by 5:30 a.m. with coffee and food in the gymnasium. People were coming in really sick, coughing. Some were throwing up from the chlorine, McNeil said. Outside, Sheriff Chase monitored radio traffic from his vehicle. Chase began requesting an EMT team for people having trouble breathing. Medical help for evacuees seemed unanticipated. McNeil: "It was extremely chaotic. I stayed actually through the morning trying to help out because there were so many people coming in and there were so few medical units per person." As the Alberton evacuees streamed in, he said, "It just seemed like everything reeked of chlorine." McNeil mostly documented, taking names and addresses of people and whether they left animals at home. But for people coughing and hacking, really sick from it, he said, he triaged and had the few medics examine the worst. "I don't ever remember anything like a doctor coming out," he said, "just maybe EMTs, ambulance crews." McNeil recalled no decontamination. Jess Mickelson said it would have been up to I.C. Waldron to set up a decon station at the evacuee center. Ironically, the high school had showers available, unused. Blown by the gas, hundreds fled to Frenchtown. Alberton firefighter Terry Fairbanks said the school was just packed there. There was great uncertainty about how many people evacuated. "This incident does not have a definite number of evacuees," IC later noted. No formal check-in was required by the Red Cross. Estimates ran of about 500 people at the school. Final accounts estimated about 1,000 people evacuated. Many evacuees complained of long waits for information, limited medical care, and lack of decontamination, and even questioned the safety of the evac location. Steve Shug thought the smell at Frenchtown still very strong. "I don't understand why they didn't just go ahead and move us to Missoula and get us away from that smell, because it made me sick," Shug recalled, not speculating whether the smell also came from contaminated people. Pat and Linda Walsh noticed a strong chlorine odor at the high school. "You could smell it," Colleen Howard said. "I think it was emanating off of everyone's clothes and vehicles." Ambient air or fellow evacuees, the conditions allowed continuing exposure. Randy Crisco said everybody was just coughing and wheezing, but there was no decontamination or medical help besides oxygen. As the hours went by, Beverly Ridenauer said, "No one told us, get out of our clothes, go shower. No one told us to do nothing." Larry Mickelson recalled a growing frustration among the hundreds of people at the school, some who later said they waited up to 5 hours, and yet nobody from Montana Rail Link came to Frenchtown and gave us an explanation or told us what the situation was. Jay Stiles: "Everybody was standing around wondering just what the hell we were supposed to do. There was nobody giving directions. The highest visible authorities were EMTs and volunteer firemen. After standing around for about an hour, feeling frustrated and nauseous, the Stiles went to a Missoula motel and crashed, exhausted. We all fell asleep for about 4 hours in the motel," Stiles said, "and woke up with just pounding, thumping headaches. Not advised to decontaminate, they hadn't showered or changed clothes. As a matter of fact," he said, "the wife went to bed with her contacts still in, and they more or less melted to her eyes. She can't even wear contacts anymore. Her eyes were so sore and so beet red, and the gases were in behind the contacts." Missoula hospitals had no gross decontamination units at the time. At 9:24 a.m., MRL finally provided a hotline for spill victims to call for information on motels, money, and extra clothing. MRL eventually booked 600 rooms for evacuees and various responders. Evacuees, especially at Frenchtown High School, had been in limbo beginning around 5 a.m. This long wait suggested MRL and officials were in doubt for hours about whether residents would need to stay out overnight, despite the rupture of at least one tank of liquid chlorine. Gordon Hendrick, mayor of Superior, worked railroads for 28 years, including as section foreman with MRL. Hendrick's hazmat training led him to make sure evacuees to Superior received decontamination. When Hendrick heard about the spill from MRL dispatch, he informed MRL of his training and went to the Superior Hospital, where he registered evacuees. Only 14 evacuees arrived, but Hendrick made sure they removed their clothes for laundering and had showers, standard procedure for chlorine exposure. Despite that MRL approved Hendrick's procedures at Superior and that MRL had its own hazmat specialist, there was no indication that MRL advised Missoula hospitals to decontaminate victims. However, MRL shouldn't have needed to. Some victims reported their clothes stuck to their skin and burned them. Many evacuees felt that being around others with the stink of contamination made them feel worse. Hendrick was incredulous that countless victims in Missoula remained in their contaminated clothes up to days. "Oh, no, 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 you're kidding me," he said. The evacuees Hendrick met at the Superior Hospital had reeked. "Oh, the chlorine smell. It burned your sinuses," he said. Hendrick was also aware of cross-contamination. "There was a bread truck, and the bread company were going to resell the bread. And I said, 'You can't. That's contaminated. You can't. You get rid of that stuff now.' I said, 'You clean that truck out.' The driver had been caught on the freeway during the release, on his way to Alberton. The driver was really sick," Hendrick said. He heard later that when they brought the bread truck back to the company, that the guys were getting sick trying to clean the truck out because it smelled so bad. The media never questioned or investigated decontamination procedures. Anticipation of a flood of evacuees with potential injuries was generally lacking. Missoula hospitals were about to be inundated with victims of toxic gas exposure. Reportedly, more than 30 patients were ambulanced to local hospitals, but many more would walk in. Initial concerns seemed downplayed, if uncertain. At 5:12 a.m., a Missoula medical unit, a MESI, Missoula Emergency Services, Inc., prepared to rendezvous with Steve Franklin's ambulance, transporting the engineers outside of Frenchtown for a transfer. A MESI crewman asked 911, "Is this an exposure we need to worry about? I'm concerned with chemicals on the patients." No response was logged. Franklin later said the engineers were just reeking, their clothes were just saturated. A couple minutes after the messy exchange, Dr. Warren Guffin, an emergency medicine doctor out of St. Patrick's Hospital, told the Missoula ambulance crew, "We've got the potential for a lot of patients coming and expecting treatment that's basically not treatable. Minimal respiratory irritation, no treatment except removal from the scene. We've had 5 arrive here already, all with minimal symptoms. No treatment is going to be necessary. And if some of that can be avoided, please, so people who really don't need the intervention, then that might help the system a little bit. Thanks." At 5:18 a.m., Guffin called 911 directly. While his earlier messy exchange held some common sense, especially as he had seen 5 cases that, in his opinion, reflected minimal exposure, he now made broad assumptions. Guffin told 911's Driggers, "We've got the potential for having hundreds of people passing on the interstate thinking they've been exposed to something terribly toxic and therefore thinking they need medical care. They may be collecting a bunch of people out there with some minimal respiratory distress." 911, "Okay." Dr. Guffin, "The information I guess I'd like to convey to whoever is going to be the incident commander out there is that almost all of these people are going to need no medical intervention. The treatment is basically removal from the scene, and if their coughing spasms don't persist, if they go away rather readily, they need no medical care." 911, "Okay." Dr. Guffin, "It's not something that has an antidote. It's basically an irritant only." 911 passed this information on to Frenchtown Command, who prudently responded, "We're still going to dispatch them to the hospital if they're having breathing difficulties." The medical advice Guffin gave authorities was sweeping in its assumptions about chlorine and people's exposures and reactions. Guffin also had no idea if more than chlorine had spilled. He also referred only to drivers on the highway, seemingly unaware that people were being gassed at their homes. Plateau Road Resident 1 claimed an ER doctor said that MRL had provided a written protocol for chlorine symptoms and treatment that implied the exposure was not serious. Regardless of Guffin's advice, the hospital was soon overwhelmed. Franklin, "It was just chaos in there, down at St. Pat's. I mean, there was people everywhere." Now 911 incorporated Guffin's limited information affecting how they advised callers. One caller at 6 a.m. told 911 that a resident was having problems breathing and having a hard time even getting dressed, he said. "I think they're in trouble. I think it's from that chlorine gas." Mrs. Perrine was reported as laying on the floor. But when another caller asked if it was safe for her to leave the area with her baby, 911 replied, "It's just an irritant, is what one of the doctors told me. It doesn't require any kind of anti-venom or anything like that." Caller, "Is it safe to drive out of here?" 911, "It's a chlorine gas is what it is. It's not lethal." Around 7 a.m., a caller from Sawmill Gulch told 911 her diabetic husband was holed up in an Alberton school, uncertain of what to do after showing up for work unaware of the spill. Caller, is there anybody in Alberton with oxygen masks? 911, no, it's just an irritant. It's not a poison. Caller, okay, he was getting woozy. The dispatcher offered to send an ambulance, but 911 assumed there was no need for respiratory protection. The result of Dr. Guffin's advice was for 911 to downplay the risks without knowing anything about people's potential exposures or understanding the full danger from chlorine gas. Golden said the DOT handbook and advice from Dr. Guffin were 911's only sources for medical information on chlorine. But MRL's Ray Hoff had earlier advised 911 that chlorine was a, quote, very poisonous gas. The DOT emergency guidebook warned, avoid inhalation of fumes, and toxic, may be fatal if inhaled or absorbed through skin, and contact with gas or liquefied gas may cause burns, severe injury. By the logs, 911 never advised anyone that chlorine was a toxic gas, potentially life-threatening. Investigation. Around 4:30 a.m., Missoula Rural Fire Department dispatched the regional hazmat team. Battalion Chief Jess Mickelson, supervisor of the team, reported at 5:30 a.m. being at the 9 Mile County Shopyard with Waldron, waiting on his hazmat crew. Mickelson was about to initiate chlorine monitoring, while the hazmat team would investigate the spill. Missoula Hazmat had 2 certified technicians, Tom Ziegler and John Fiddler, with 2 others in training. At the time, Missoula Rural Fire Department had the only hazmat response team in western Montana. Hazmat was a buzzword, Ziegler recalled. He helped form the regional team, all of 2 weeks old. We were trying to get a big team in case something happened, he said. Something did. Ziegler met Fiddler at Missoula Rural Station 2 near the Missoula Airport. John Fiddler and I took one of the chief's cars, and we were going to go in as a recon, in advance of the hazmat rig, later arriving at 9 Mile. Around 5:15 a.m., they stopped at Stone Container for a chlorine rail kit, which had tools to use on the tank dome to control valves. Missoula Hazmat had only 1 chlorine monitor, which were expensive to maintain, and currently on the incoming rig, so they grabbed another one from Stone Container. Fiddler recalled a faint odor of bleach near 9 Mile. You can smell it at a really low level, he said. It's not really hazardous at such levels. Still waiting on the hazmat rig, which didn't leave Missoula Station 2 until about 6 a.m., Mickelson was anxious to start monitoring for medical surveillance at least, he said, and then the team could go to the site. Around 5:30 a.m., Ziegler said, as we just passed the 9 Mile turnoff, our eyes started to itch a little bit. Cars continued to evacuate from the west, and they radioed to see if I-90 was closed. It was hard to get information at that time. We didn't know who was on scene, Ziegler said. The men headed west from 9 Mile to investigate the location of the spill, literally groping in the dark. No one knew where the accident occurred, Ziegler believed. All we know is that we have a train derailment, so we were just driving to see if we could find anything. Mickelson was getting no information from MRL and apparently not from Waldron either. Ziegler said they had no SCBA and Level A suits, which were on the hazmat rig. Mickelson recalled they had filter escape masks. The duo was on an exploratory investigation for the source of a toxic spill, not knowing how much chlorine had spilled or what else might have, driving into the night largely using their senses to guide them. Ziegler, we got about halfway to Alberton and had to turn around. The gas became too stout, about 2 miles west of 9 Mile. Fiddler, when you get to a quantity where you start coughing and hacking, you're still probably okay, as long as you take that as a sign that you should leave. Though their eyes were irritated, Ziegler didn't recall getting any readings. The monitor was set to alarm at 10 parts per million, the IDLH. Mickelson, in radio contact, recalled that they did get some readings. Regardless, their bodies told them they were exposed. We had nothing, Ziegler said, for protection, denying they even had filter masks. A naked recon. We turned around and we came back to 9 Mile. The preliminary reconnaissance confirmed the obvious. Chlorine was in the air. Monitoring began at forward command near the 9 Mile exit about 5:30 a.m., and Mickelson recalled readings no higher than 2 parts per million, but that would have caused significant irritation. No chlorine readings were documented at this time. No part of the gas cloud was measured during at least the first 86 minutes after the spill. Conditions were changing. A light rain had begun falling with no report of wind. However, the Weather Bureau reported 20-mile-per-hour winds at 6,000 feet, 3,000 feet higher, with an eastward drift in the valley bottom, the likely cause of the gas generally shifting east. Evacuation. Around 5:34 a.m., Deputy Walrod, stationed at the 9-mile exit roadblock, radioed to Hints and 911, "I'm getting relieved here, and I'm going to move to Huson and set up there. It's just too strong here." Walrod noted the wind had picked up a bit, bringing the gas with it. 20 minutes after Forward Command relocated to 9 Mile, gas had reached 9 Mile exit, about 9 road miles from the spill. At 5:45 a.m., MRL's Dave Swanson called MRL dispatch. "I've backed off to Huson now," he said. "The firemen and everybody abandoned the hill at 9 Mile, so I backed up." Swanson implied that everybody had abandoned the area because of the gas. This alarming call was the only mention of a broad retreat. The Missoula hazmat log documented little at the time. Walrod retreated before being relieved, reporting there was no deputy at the roadblock at about 5:50 a.m. Missoula Hazmat didn't recall any temporary retreat from 9 Mile, but Mickelson and Hazmat were at the command post, not the roadblock. The command post was just to the south of the freeway on the 9 Mile hill, about the same elevation as the roadblock. However, the command post crew had access to the DOT office for operations, while the roadblock crew stayed in leaky vehicles. Considering poor communications, it wasn't surprising if the command post didn't know the status of the roadblock on the other side of I-90. During her escape with her Colt, Ponderosa resident 1 had noted, "When I got to the 9 Mile bridge, the cloud was already there. You could see it, you could smell it." There was no concern for areas east of 9 Mile, but officials had again underestimated the movement of the cloud. All evacuations had begun in areas after the gas had arrived. Gas drifted further east. At 6:15 a.m., Mrs. Wicks, who lived right on the river below the 9 Mile exit, reported an awful smell. She and her grandson were asthmatic, and she was kind of choking up, she said. Wicks hadn't heard of any evacuation, and 911 advised she leave. 30 minutes after Deputy Walrod was driven from the 9 Mile roadblock by the gas, these residents reported exposure below the command post. Likely the worst of the gas moving by the 9 Mile hill was down near the river, but the reports from up Roscoe Road indicated lift as well. At about 6:20 a.m., Missoula Hazmat's Mickelson reported that Chief Waldron is going to relocate to Frenchtown, who is the overall incident commander. "I have a 2-man recon that's going to go out and explore the boundaries here." Incident command would be at Frenchtown Fire Station 1 with Waldron, and 9 Mile became forward ops run by Missoula Hazmat. Waldron felt, "We knew pretty much what the parameters were that we needed to maintain an evacuation in, and we had that kind of done," he said. "I went back to the station to try to figure out where we went from there." But at 6:23 a.m., a search and rescue responder en route to 9 Mile reported he was not quite to Huson, "and we can smell it here now," he said. Fresh responders and noses established that the gas now extended east 12 road miles from the spill. "I'm not surprised," replied a fireman from 9 Mile Ops. "Down in the valley, it's going to be a little more pronounced than here. We've been monitoring here. We're showing 0.2 parts per million, so we're comfortable with our decision to stay here." This was the first documentation in the logs of a monitoring level regarding the Alberton spill. The chlorine levels at Huson, 3 miles further east, were apparently higher than the 9 Mile hill. At 6:25 a.m., Deputy Howard Reed, staffing the roadblock, reported, "I'm at the Huson exit with Deputy Walrod. We can smell it here. My suggestion is to try to shut this down at Frenchtown." But I.C. Waldron made no call to evacuate further east. In preparation for a possible prolonged interstate detour, Montana Highway Patrol and DOT soon closed I-90 from the Y to St. Regis, a 63-mile stretch and the largest I-90 closure in the region's history. Within only a day, the closure would become the longest in I-90's history. The Y was the intersection between I-90 and the road north. The Y and St. Regis were the intersection points for the detour north. At 6:33 a.m., Department of Emergency Services, DES, finally gave 911 a public call number, and Incident Command advised 911 to refer all calls about evacuation to the Emergency Operations Center. Along with help from extra dispatchers, 911 ebbed away from chaos. 2.5 hours passed for an emergency information number to be established, and only then did IC inform 911 and DES exactly what areas were being evacuated. Up to now, evacuation and spill information had often been inaccurate and a guessing game, largely because Waldron was not updating 911 and DES. Jess Mickelson said such a call line normally would have been set up within 10 minutes. The media had known little about the gas cloud and evacuations beyond the belated and vague means alert, and was an ineffective conduit for information. Missoula Rural Fire Department's Bill Reed would become the public information officer to handle media calls, but was not on the job until about 7:30 a.m. For over 3 hours after the spill, there was no official contact for the media. At 6:41 a.m., Deputy Reed told the sheriff's office, "It's getting so strong in the canyon. I'm getting complaints from people here in Huson." The gas had driven unprotected deputies from 9 Mile and was now strong at Huson. Deputy Reed again suggested evacuating further east. "I talked to a couple that just came out from east of 9 Mile Hill. They're complaining of sore throats, so I suggest at least to Huson." Deputy Walrod wrote in his log, "So strong in canyon. Huson people are complaining. Waldron advised. Felt it was not necessary to do anything at this time." Sergeant Dave Ball recalled that Waldron said, "Well, no, let's hold off for a while." I think he wanted to do more monitoring was his point. No monitoring levels between 9 Mile and Huson were logged, but residents and deputies were at least irritated by the gas. Waldron didn't think responders at roadblocks to the east were getting seriously exposed. Waldron, "Not to the east of us, no. You've got to remember that chlorine was being smelled clear into Frenchtown. It can be smelled at less than 1 part per million, I think, which is not hazardous to your health, but you can smell it. You had to evaluate whether it's a risk, and I defaulted to the hazmat team to help us in determining where the risk was. We had to default to the monitoring process. Just because people were smelling chlorine didn't mean they were at risk." But little monitoring was taking place, and conditions were highly variable and changing. People were highly variable as well, and some to the east had symptoms triggering escape. At 6:44 a.m., another resident living along the Clark Fork River below the 9 Mile exit told 911 the smell outside was terrible. "I mean, it's very strong," he said. The caller had not been evacuated and was concerned about his horses. "Oh my God, it's so strong outside you can't even take a breath in it," the caller said. 911, "If it's that strong, then you should evacuate." Waldron still didn't order more evacuations. Dave Ball recalled, "I know that just the odor is not enough to declare it's unsafe to be there. But when you have some of the other symptoms, that's your first key, if you don't have the scientific measurement behind it to be able to back it up. The things like tearing and coughing and whatever, that's a good indicator that you're in the wrong place." Hazmat's Jess Mickelson, staged at Forward Ops, heard these complaints, but he felt safe up on 9 Mile Hill and wasn't concerned about east of 9 Mile having real issues of exposure. Based on monitoring, he thought deputies were over-concerned. But monitoring was very limited and little was documented, and Forward Ops was about 150 feet above the river and the lower residence. Sergeant Reed finally began evacuations at the mouth of 9 Mile at 7:30 a.m. Reports and complaints of smelling chlorine near Huson began at 6:23 a.m., and calls continued. Around 7:05 a.m., a resident of the 6 Mile Valley told 911, "It smells really strong of chlorine bleach or chlorine out there." This area had not been evacuated, yet 911 advised, "If you can smell it, I would evacuate." At the same time, the emergency operations log noted that Trudy Green off of Hoole Creek can smell gas. Hoole Creek was another drainage north of Huson. Scant reports came in about readings. Despite residents' complaints and reports from deputies at roadblocks, there was no log of readings beyond 9 Mile and no call for further evacuation. Evacuations near Petty Creek continued, slowly. South of the river at 7:28 a.m., Deputy Van Wormer reported to Sergeant Ball of having visited all Southside Road homes but 2, adding the chlorine was pretty strong hanging out here down by the river. Deputy Hintz finally agreed to 2 officers to assist him on Ponderosa Acres. They arrived at 7:30 a.m. The gas pushed on. Some people moving toward the evacuated area were ignorant of the spill. Wayne Wasser lived 13 miles up the 9 Mile Valley. A mechanic for FedEx by the Missoula County Airport, he left home at 5 a.m., unaware of the crisis. When the school bus failed to pick up his children, Wasser's wife Terry decided she was going to load the kids up and take them to school in Alberton. The family met a roadblock for local westbound traffic by the 9 Mile house on the frontage road, and fire trucks were staged in the restaurant parking lot. Wasser's son, Brandon, 10, thought they spent close to half an hour in the area as Terry talked to firemen. They said they smelled chlorine, Wasser said of his wife and 7-year-old son, Conrad. It made me kind of dizzy, but I couldn't really smell it, Brandon recalled. Wasser got off work around 2:30 p.m. And I could smell it in Frenchtown, and when you got to Hughson, you could really smell it, he said. He knew a woman who lived about a quarter mile up from the 9 Mile house, an area not evacuated. Her place just got wiped out from it, he said. It even killed the fish in her fish tank. That's right where Conrad got it, was right by her place. Nothing north of the mouth of the 9 Mile was evacuated, but gas was reported up the drainage, well beyond the 9 Mile house. Scott Duncan lived about 3.5 miles up 9 Mile Creek. He only heard about the spill from a friend around 7:30 a.m. Duncan's house was up a little bench, and as he walked down his long drive to get his newspaper, there was this kind of weird smell and texture to the air, he said. And by the time I got the paper and started walking back, my eyes were watering a little bit and my gums and tongue tasted really funny. Duncan saw no visible gas. But definitely the product had wafted up 9 Mile Creek and into this area, he said. As with the Petty Creek drainage to the south, somehow gas had arrived up the drainage. 9 Mile residents were not considered in harm's way, and not even told to avoid going outdoors or south into the Clark Fork Valley. Further west up the 9 Mile, Roger and Ada Chalmers were wide awake the night of the spill, fighting the threat of flooding. The Chalmers lived about 7 miles up the 9 Mile drainage, which ran northwest. Some 6 air miles and at least 2,500 vertical feet of mountains lay between the spill and their house to the northeast. Many people would doubt any of the gas cloud made it their way. Roger Chalmers and a house guest had stayed up into the early morning digging trenches around the house to divert flooding. Sometime around 4 a.m., Ada and Roger heard loud sounds to the south and later believed they had heard the derailment. Sometime later, Roger said a helicopter flew right overhead from the west, so low it about knocked us over, he said. They wondered what the crazy pilot was doing there. When they were back out digging again, Chalmers said, I said to Darren, do you smell something? Chalmers said he never smelled chlorine that night, only something like mahogany. The men continued trying to channel the water, and shortly afterward, as they walked the area to survey the flood threat, Chalmers said he turned around to go back in the house and woke up on the ground. I about half stood up, took a step, and woke up back on the ground again, he said. Once inside, feeling dizzy and his heart racing, Chalmers wondered if it was from high blood pressure. Chalmers said Darren blacked out as well. Our lips were tingling. We had a metal taste in our mouth, Chalmers said. Around 6 a.m., the men came inside. After a couple hours' sleep, Ada and Roger felt like they had caught the flu. My eyes were burning, my face, my throat, Ada said. Roger, we didn't know we'd been in any kind of chemical incident. That morning, Ada said she saw hundreds of birds, hundreds, coming through these trees. They get about that far off the ground and then roll down on the ground and get about that far back up and go down again. They were tumbling. Those trees were absolutely jam-packed. From chickadees to crows, they flew from the south, headed northwest. Deer in the yard seemed upset, their noses and eyes streaming mucus. Roger, we didn't find out till 9 in the morning that something had happened, after expected contractors didn't show up. Chalmers called 911, who told him he was in a safe zone. At 9 a.m., they saw the CNN footage about the spill. The Chalmers began to rethink the events of the previous night, and Roger thought the helicopter was from CNN. He called the airport, which confirmed a CNN helicopter, he said. As the morning wore on, Ada felt weak, sicker by the minute. Roger began making calls. I called Washington, D.C., the EPA, and they put me through a 45-minute survey, and they interrupted and said, we're dispatching 2 people. They said, we think you should be advised you're in a toxic zone based on the answers that we've gotten from you. But they didn't have the authority to evacuate me. Around 12:30 p.m., Roger called a talk radio show that was interviewing an MRL representative, and soon the Chalmers and their guests were officially evacuated and headed for a Missoula motel. Scott Waldron later said, "There were people clear up 9 Mile that claimed they couldn't breathe, but when we went up there and monitored, the readings were within tolerable limits," claiming the hazmat team had monitored there. There was no log of readings, but Waldron seemed to confirm that low levels were found. Lucinda Hodges spent the morning at her mother's Missoula trailer, which her sister owned and had for sale. A week before the spill, Hodges had moved her Uncle Paul, an elderly stroke victim, to the trailer from Florida. Her mother normally lived with Hodges in Alberton and luckily had been staying with Paul while they sought a nursing home in Missoula. The trailer had few furnishings besides Paul's rented bed. Hodges heard on the radio about a Montana Rail Link hotline, and by noon she was registered at the Red Line Inn. The boys were ecstatic. She went to Target and bought some overnight things, thinking it would be just a day or two that they'd be out. MRL's Alan Anderson had been very friendly and said they could eat at the motel on the house. After Hanson met up with his son, he decided to stay in Frenchtown with a friend because he felt the evacuation would end soon and disliked motels, Hodges said. Hodges had been worried, but if Hanson had any health problems, he didn't complain. "At that point, I didn't think we were really affected," Hodges said. "I knew I didn't feel right, but I kept thinking it's the adrenaline of having the near-death experience. I didn't feel like it had really affected my breathing, nothing at all dramatic. They were alive. They'd survived. They would all be okay." She had no inkling that nothing would ever be the same. MRL lawyers would later downplay area exposures by saying the release of chlorine was like a drop in a bucket. Alberton had been thoroughly gassed. Next time on Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment, the Missoula hazmat team of Ziegler and Fiddler conduct a reconnaissance to find the spill site, still not knowing its location. Meanwhile, the gas continues to expand to the east, prompting more evacuations. Till then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the 2-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, the true story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.